So we're looking at resources that are available. Here I'm talking about books, and what's any good school session without show and tell. So a book that I have found extremely helpful over the years is by Father Harold Buteau, called The Catholic School, Its Roots, Identity, and Future. He taught at Catholic U in the School of Ed for probably 40 years. And I think he's gone to God. If he hasn't, he's like Methuselah. But when I was beginning my doctoral studies, I happened upon this book. And it was of great, great value. And it still is. Now, it was written in, actually I didn't do it when I was starting graduate work. It was 1988 it came out. I think there may have been an earlier edition. But in his introduction, he discusses philosophy, the concept of education, how that's different from schooling. This is one of the things that I'm always surprised, and well, I guess not really, but when people say, oh, he's got all of those degrees. Well, what does that mean? Okay, does he know anything as a result of it? And he was 22 years in school. Well, again, does that mean anything? And there's a heck of a difference between schooling and education. And you can be educated without going to school, and you can go to school without being educated. And Father Buteau deals with that. And then chapter 2, why some people are against our schools, opponents' mindset. And then 3, the thinking behind those who favor Catholic schools, the proponents' mindset. 4, what Catholic schools aim at, goals. 5, how Catholic schools propose to get there, religion and values in the curriculum. 6, initial partners in the process, family and church. 7, the other partner, the state. 8, what Catholic schools have to deal with, the atmosphere. 9, it's Catholic schools there, teachers. And 10, the object and end of it all, the students. And as you can see, it's a rather hefty and comprehensive. I'll just put these here, and I'll leave them on the side, and then you can, please, don't steal them, okay? We know how priests have ideas about, I worked for a pastor once. Every time he went to a priest's funeral somewhere, he would purloin something from the environment, a stole or a cincture or what. And I said, well, Monsignor, what are you doing? He said, well, we're all a corporation soul, so it's just transferring property from one branch to another. And then this is a book by Father James Heft, who's a Marianist father, and for some years had been the president of University of Dayton. Tried, rather probably unsuccessly, to turn the place around. But it's Catholic high schools facing the new realities. And again, this is, he's been through the whole system himself, as a student, as a teacher, as an administrator. And this outline, conditions for success, historical developments, American culture and religion. And the bishop has mentioned this several times. He's a great one, talking about what's the culture. And you got to know it. Whether you like it or not, you have to know what the culture is, because that's the framework in which we're going to be doing our work. And it's the same thing with sometimes people of a more traditional bent will say, who cares about the Gallup poll? How many Catholics believe what we teach or not? Well, no, we're not determining teaching on the basis of the Gallup poll, but it's good to know where the people are so that you know how to deal with the phenomenon. And so it does us no good to deny that 85% of Catholic women of childbearing age practice birth control. That doesn't mean that they're right, and it doesn't mean that the teaching of the church is wrong, but it's important to know that fact, right? And so he talks about the cultural phenomenon. Chapter 4, the mission, moral and religious formation. And then 2 chapters on leadership, theological sources for leadership and moral sources for leadership. Chapter 7, students today. So here's the sociological phenomenon. Chapter 8, teachers, calling and response. 9, new models and more money. 10, the future of Catholic high schools. And so that's, then there's a volume that came out a couple of years ago. There's a Jesuit who's Catholic, and Father John Piderit, who for a number of years was the president of Loyola Chicago, and tried to turn that place around, and he ended up getting fired. And then for some, and he's from the New York province of Jesuits, and for some years after that, taught at Fordham, lived in a parish in the Bronx, which is where I got to know him. And then when Archbishop Cordileone took over San Francisco, he brought Father Piderit on board as Vicar General. And Father Piderit for years has been running workshops on for Catholic higher education, trying to make some inroads into the mess of what exists in most of these places. And there's a woman, colleague of his, Melanie Morey, who are sort of a tag team when they do these workshops. And this volume is called Teaching the Tradition, Catholic Themes in Academic Disciplines. And they're the editors of it, and they brought together a very impressive group of scholars that in their various fields, and it spans everything from history to math to science, languages, literature, everything, how to incorporate the Catholic intellectual tradition into all of those disciplines. So it's an interdisciplinary manual, if you will. And so this atomized, compartmentalized approach to education is shown, A, to be very, very faulty, and over and above that, because then people say, okay, we know that that approach is wrong. Now, what do you do? And so you have part 1 is foundations, fundamental Catholic theology, Catholic anthropology, perspectives in Catholic theology. Then part 2, the Catholic intellectual tradition in the humanities. So poetry and Catholic themes, drama and Catholic themes, fiction and Catholic themes, reading Christian texts and images, political theory and Catholic themes, history in a Catholic framework, mathematics, reality and God, Catholic themes in art and music. And then part 3, religious themes related to the sciences, psychology in a Catholic framework, imagine, evolutionary biology in a Catholic framework, environmental studies, physics and astronomy. And then part 4, the good life in the professions, economics and business in a Catholic framework, education in a Catholic framework, medicine, health and Catholic themes, law in a Catholic framework. So, it's obvious, it's not bedtime reading, huh? And it's not the kind of book, at least not the kind that I would sit and read all the way through. But it's something very worthwhile, if you're in high school work, to photocopy this section on literature, give it to the head of the language department, the English department, just to someone who heads the science department, and so forth. This is by Timothy Walk, The Parish School, American Catholic Parochial Education from Colonial Times to the Present. And I'm looking at this picture, which looks like it's fourth graders in the 50s. And that must have been a standard photo in Catholic schools, because I've got one from second grade, and we're all positioned in exactly the same way, except we have the nun in the picture in ours. And when I show that picture to people, and I say, can you pick me out? And they all have, almost everybody's able to do it, because what they discover is I'm the kid in the picture with a cowlick. And so chapter 1, origins of Catholic education. 2, strangers in the land. So that the immigrant phenomenon of Catholicism in the country. 3, a range of educational experiences. The campaign for control. and we talked about that, considerably yesterday afternoon in terms of modes of governance and so forth. New models for parish schools, the school controversy, the search for order, Catholic education and modern American society, the making of. I don't know if it was very common in Philadelphia, but in Newark, particularly with the Sisters of Charity, who at my time as a kid, they had 3,500 sisters in the congregation. The summer of '68, they lost 2,000 in one summer. That's because of renewal. At any rate, but they were superb educators, but they had a tremendous system of ongoing formation of their sisters. They ran, I think they still have, St. Vincent's Academy in downtown Newark, which is a girls' high school. But it was amazing. If you were going shopping in downtown Newark on a Saturday, you saw hundreds of Sisters of Charity getting off buses to go to St. Vincent's Academy. Saturdays were their continuing education days. And some of them were finishing bachelor's degrees. Most of them were already going for master's. And the degree was coming from their college, which is now in the Patterson Diocese. Originally, when it was started, it was the Newark Archdiocese. But they were really, really superb teachers. Chapter 10, the church-state schools question, which we handled a bit yesterday. Chapter 11, a generation of crisis. 12, Catholic schools observed. 13, the church-state school question revisited. And 14, a decade of doubt and resolve. It's a very meaty in terms of the historical background, which I think is important to appreciate, and then some very realistic assessments about where we are. This is by 3 authors that have done a lot of work in Catholic education: Anthony Brick, Valerie Lee, and Peter Holland. Catholic Schools and the Common Good. And it tends toward the heady side of things, but again, I think it's worthwhile. Section 1, the tradition of Catholic schools, and then followed by research, past and present, and then institutional analysis, classroom life, curriculum and academic organization, communal organization and governance. Section 3, diversity among Catholic schools, the transition to high school, variations in internal operations, single-sex versus coeducational schools, and effects, the impact of academic organization, the impact of communal organization, and then Section 5, implications, Catholic lessons for America's schools, and then the epilogue, the future of Catholic high schools. This is the book I was thinking of earlier by Harold Butow, Of Singular Benefit. That's the precursor to the one that I showed you already, the story of U.S. Catholic education. And this came out in 1970. When I was beginning my doctoral studies, and since I was going to be doing it on the Supreme Court in Catholic schools, there's a bookstore in downtown Manhattan called The Strand. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's a 5-story bookstore, and historically they're collectors and distributors of rare books and old books, and you go in there and have a bibliographic orgy. But I went there when I started to find source books, particularly in school law issues and so forth. And this is where I actually happened upon Father Butow for the first time. And it's a wonderful book. Chapter 1, to 1783, the colonial period of transplantation. So the Spanish missions, the French missions, English colonies. Then Section 2, the formative foundations, 1784 to 1828. Relative conditions of the Church, educational conditions, the Archdiocese of Baltimore, Diocese of Detroit, Bardstown, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Charleston, federal levels, Southern colonies, New England, and middle colonies. And then the period of transition, 1829 to 1884, the dioceses of Cincinnati, Vincennes, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and then he calls them slower dioceses. Section 4, further growth, the new immigration, tumult in the church, the lay trustee controversy, the school controversy, the Americanist heresy. Section 5, maturing process, 1918 to 1957, with a whole panoply of official church statements on education, the Supreme Court and Catholic education. And then Chapter 6, 1958 to the present, contemporary soul searching and ferment. And of course, he ends the book in 1970 on sort of a hopeful note. When I saw him last, which was probably about 10 years ago, he wasn't quite so hopeful anymore. You saw this. Anthony gave everybody a copy yesterday. There are still extra copies there if you want to take them. And then as a footnote to the book story from that side, over here, anything that's there, feel free to take. Monsignor, you weren't here last night, were you? There's some material you might find useful for your school. The Dominican Sisters from Ann Arbor, Michigan, produce a virtue-based education for grammar school kids. And there are packets there that I think everybody enjoyed considerably. Laura Berquist, Designing Your Own Classical Curriculum, A Guide to Catholic Home Education. As I've already indicated, I'm not a fan of homeschooling, but I think the principles that she utilizes here for putting together a classical curriculum are very, very helpful. And it's by grade level, and it's very, very professionally done. And this is a book I alluded to yesterday. It's by Samuel Blumenfeld. And it's called Is Public Education Necessary? And back in the mid-'80s, he and I were on a panel convoked by the commissioner, the state commissioner for education in Connecticut. And it was held at Sacred Heart University in Bridgeport. And it was on the whole question of the relationship between so-called public education and so-called private education. And the Commissioner of Education's position, of course, was that their school system, the government school system, was the unum necessarium for education. This is what had done everything to make America great. But we did believe that there was a place for alternate forms for those who either needed it or wanted it. Well, into the discussion comes this Samuel Blumenfeld, who was a secular Jew. And I was, very careful in my approach to things. I very clearly reminded everybody that all schools in America for the first 100 years were religious schools. But he came out with both barrels going, and he said, well, I've just come out with a book, and here it is public education necessary? And he just went on a rip of the whole idea of the government being involved in schools at all. And he says, after more than 100 years of universal public education, we can say that it nowhere resembles the utopian vision that drove its proponents to create it. It has not produced the morally improved human being the Unitarians insisted it would, nor has it changed human nature in the way the Owenites predicted. Ironically, one of the public school's biggest problems today is the physical safety of its teachers. It's turned education into a quagmire of conflicting interests, ideologies, and purposes, and created a bureaucracy that permits virtually no real learning to take place. Non-sectarian education has become secular humanist indoctrination. As biased in its worldview against religion as Calvinism was in its favor. The Catholics were aware enough to see what it would all lead to and bolted the public school rather than accept the destruction of their faith. As for the normal schools, they have blossomed into state teachers' colleges that cannot produce competent instructors in basic skills. The whole experiment has been a colossal failure. As for Hegelian statism, which was to prove how good and just man could be once liberated from the restraints of outmoded religion, it has instead produced statist tyrannies and rivalries, the likes of which the human race has never seen, and brought humanity to the brink of its own self-annihilation. The only bright spot in the whole picture is the technological wonder that capitalism has brought to mankind through the very individual competitive system that Owen railed against and Channing deplored. Neither liberal altruism nor universal public education nor socialism lifted the poor from their depths. Capitalism did. Is public education necessary? The obvious answer is it was not needed then, and it's certainly not needed today. Schools are necessary, but they can be created by free enterprise today as they were before the public school movement achieved its fraudulent state monopoly in education. Subject education to the same competitive market forces that other goods and services are subjected to, and will see far better education at much lower overall cost. Instead of a, quote, crusade against ignorance to reform the world, we shall have schools capable of performing the limited and practical functions that schools were originally created to perform. The failure of public education is the failure of statism as a political philosophy. It has been tried, it has been found sorely wanting. Having learned from our mistakes, would it not be better to return to the basic principles upon which this nation was founded? Education was not seen then as the cure-all for mankind's moral diseases, but it was on that premise that the reformers built the present system. They were wrong. The system cannot work because in a free society, government, and here's the key sentence of the whole book, in a free society, government has no more place in education than it does in religion. Once Americans grasp the full significance of this idea, they will understand why the return of educational freedom is essential to the preservation and expansion of American freedom in general. And the point he says earlier in the book, which he then summarizes.
So outside of that, he's all in on public
education.
That's right.
That's right. And I mean, the commissioner of education, I think we had to do CPR on him when the session was done. But his point is very interesting. He says, why does the government not belong involved in running schools? He said, because just as they don't belong involved in running churches, he said, because it's control of men's minds and hearts. And that's not the function of government in a free society, number one. Number two, you look at every totalitarian revolution in history, what's the first thing that is done? It's not closing churches, it's closing alternate forms of education. Because we can tolerate people going to a church or a synagogue for a half hour, but what happens in the four walls of a school 30 to 40 hours a week, that's something entirely different. And then this classic, Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. Since this book came out, anytime I teach educational philosophy, this is one of the 3 required texts to be read. It's a devastating critique of the abysmal ignorance that Bloom found among college students. And I think this came out in 83, is it?
26 years.
87, yeah. And now, it's interesting, Bloom thoroughly and accurately diagnoses the problem. And he says that any college professor, again, and this is in the 80s, any college professor can be sure of one thing, that 90% of the students in front of him are moral relativists. The problem is that Bloom himself is. And it's strange because he's a classical scholar by training. He did some of the great translations of Greek and Roman texts, which was his field. Was it Yale that he taught, or Harvard? Yale. But it's a superb book.
He also did he redid the Rousseau Emile.
Emile. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And Emile is the model of education.
That's right, yeah. And then, perhaps more than you ever wanted to know about school choice, what is this, 630 pages worth, Handbook of Research on School Choice by 4 men who have devoted their whole careers to it. But it's broken down very, very nicely. Section 1, Perspectives on School Choice. 2, Charter Schools. And let me say a few words about charter schools. When that phenomenon first surfaced, I found myself extremely intrigued by it and then quite supportive. I had one big question mark, which has probably turned into an exclamation point, but the big question mark was accountability. How do we know what they're doing in that institution, and what will be the means for determining the effectiveness of those institutions? And I think, probably now, 25 years into it, the conclusions are not that great, because in effect anybody can open one, and now perhaps what happens is that, thanks to the market concept of American reality, if it's not working there, people yank the kids from that. However, the big concern that I have about it is its impact on Catholic schools. And what I initially thought would be helpful in opening up a conversation on educational choice, as a matter of fact, though, I think has boomeranged against us. And so we find that charter schools are not so much competition for public schools as they've turned into competition for our schools, particularly in places where a Catholic school has closed and they take over. And some bishops have instituted, I believe, a very wise and I would say necessary policy that where a Catholic school has closed, the pastor may not rent or sell the building to a charter school. And I think that's pretty much the case in Boston. Huh? And I know there was a diocese in which the bishop was going to close about 10 grammar schools and offer them immediately to charters. And a cardinal called the bishop and said, I have no authority over you, but if you do that, you're going to put all of Catholic education in the entire country in jeopardy, because there'll be no way for people to distinguish between what that was on June 3rd versus what it is now on September the 2nd. Same building, same teachers were even going to be kept, all right? And then there's a charter phenomenon that started, I believe, in Phoenix. It's called the Great Hearts Program. And Sub Rosa, what it had intended to be for the most part, was a Catholic charter school approach to things. But what you discover, of course, is that there are all kinds. A charter school, you're a government school. And so no matter what you want to do, ultimately your hands are tied. And in one place that has had an extremely successful K-12 parish school, the pastor had hired a very, very capable man who himself was a complete product of Catholic education and had an excellent master's degree in Catholic school leadership. He had him as his headmaster for 3 or 4 years. And then the pastor started hearing rumors, sometimes rumors are true, that the guy was being courted by an opening in the brand new charter school in the city. And it turned out that the rumor was true. And the man didn't give the pastor much consideration. He only told him about the last month of the school year that he was doing it. And the pastor said, well, obviously you're a free agent, but why are you doing it? And he said, well, I think I'm discovering sort of a new mode to my vocation at this point, Father, that I'll be able to increase everything we've been doing at this school and make it available to many more hundreds of people. And the pastor said, yeah, and get about $40,000 a year more in your salary. And he said, well, yeah, I do have a couple of kids. But the nasty thing was he took about 50 kids from the school with him. Well, they say karma is a what? About a month ago, a woman came to him. He'd been at the charter school a year and, of course, discovered, he can't do there what he was doing in the Catholic school. But over and above that, about a month ago, a woman came to him with her child who had been in the school as a first grader. And she said to him, I need you to know that Johnny will be coming back in September as Jeannie. And so she'll be, she, he, whatever will be in a dress. And I insist that the registration be changed now to Jean rather than John. And he said, well, we're not doing that. He said, that's absurd. And this will cause tremendous consternation, confusion among the children, consternation among the parents and so forth. And she said, you'll do it. And he said, no, I won't. And then he got a call from the legal department of the City Board of Education and said, you'll do it. This is a state school. And I think he's probably at the point where he may want to go back to the school that he was at for a prolonged period of time. But, and that's the one point that I think parents need to be informed of. They can't be deceived into thinking that Catholic school, but there's not an explicit religion class, and okay, there's no crucifix in the classroom, but everything else is going to be the same. It's not, and it can't be. So a whole section on charters.
I could mention as well too, because we over the years, I've been at it a little while, and you look at everything to try to advance your mission. And when these things first came out, you have to look at it and see.
Yeah.
And but one of the things that was the biggest stopper was what we had contemplated was, making the school charter, doing the religion class
before
first, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Then homeroom, everyone else that has no religion can come in, all that, and then go through the rest of the day. But we realized how much of the day, like the Catholicism of the school, it goes through everything, and you just can't segment out, and it would have cost too much in terms of mission to do
That's
that.
right. Oh, sure. Yeah. And now, of course, unfortunately, in the 70s, there were a sufficient number of Catholic schools where all you had to do was excise the religion class, and there would be no difference. But if there is no difference, then there's no reason to have the school to begin with. And the whole concept of the permeation of the curriculum with religious and moral values is the precise point. Right? Otherwise, we can have no objection to CCD. That's all they're doing. It's the same thing. You got religion over here, and the rest of it's going elsewhere.
Yeah. And it's funny, like in a school, how the kids carry that mission themselves. Yeah. Like and whenever I have to hire, because you can get really good qualified people, but even like a secretary in the school is like, you do understand this is a praying environment, right? Mm-hmm. Because the kids don't make distinguishing.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter if you're the president of the school or secretary or whoever. If you're a good person, they're going to come to you. And, a secretary has to know how to receive a kid.
Sure.
Who walks in and says, will you pray for my grandmother who's in the hospital?
Yeah, sure.
Well, and that's, and math teachers and all of that.
That's right.
And it's funny, like how the kids carry it if we don't.
No. And particularly those of us who have grown up in and through the system, we take this for granted. We just presume it's the way it works, right? And as I said to you earlier in the week, this business of my teaching at this community college the past couple of years has been an eye-opener for me. Just even what questions the kids ask. 98% of these kids have not gone to a Catholic school. But last semester, a kid raised his hand very cautiously, and he said, now I teach there either philosophy or world religions or Latin. And this was a philosophy class, and the kid said, I want to ask you a question. Do I have to ask it before or after class, or can I ask it now? And I said, ask any question you want. And he said, well, it's about God. And I said, yeah. And he said, but like, this is a state school, isn't it? And I said, well, first of all, the interpretation of what the law is radical, and it doesn't correspond to the Constitution at all. I said, the God question technically can be asked anywhere at any time. I said, a public school teacher can't proselytize, but certainly there's no reason why the question can't. But just what they had been trained really for 12 years is, and one kid said to me before class, is it legal for us to call you father during class? And I said, yeah, why not? And he said, oh. He said, well, when I told my parents that I had a priest, they said, wow. And like, does he dress like a priest? And they said, yeah. Really? But no, I mean, but that's the ethos in which they've been, quote, educated.
Absolutely.
And, I think I mentioned to some of you, my first day on campus, walking across and kids saying, what happened? What happened? Well, there's a priest. Did somebody die or what? Right? It's inconceivable that there would be a presence of Christ in the church in that environment.
Even that's a little surprising, because a lot of times we don't even associate, like, to know that there's a sacrament that you call a priest at the time of death. Like,
well, no atheists in foxholes.
Yes.
I mean, that's the kind of thing that they do. That's sort of the residual superstition that remains, and they may not know what's supposed to be happening with it. Last year at the supermarket, a woman saw me and she said, you're a priest? I said, yeah. She said, Catholic? I said, yeah. Wow. My horoscope said this was going to be my lucky day. Now, I have a question for you. She said, we're putting a new boat in the water today. I said, yeah. And she said, and we want to have some kind of religious service when we do it. And I said, uh-huh. And she said, and so, I did a lot of research on this, Father. She said, I found a great prayer to Neptune and another one too. And she started listing all of these water gods. And she said, what would be a good prayer, a good Catholic prayer to use? And I said, well, and I said, well, here's my thought, sweetheart. I said, I think you would be very, very careful not to involve the one true God with any of it. And I said, and I wouldn't want to get on the boat with you after you did all this other stuff. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, if you invoke these false gods, the real God could make your boat sink. And she said, oh my God, I never thought about that. And she got on the cell phone with her husband immediately and said, she said, cancel all those prayers. But this is what we're dealing with. I mean, cancel them, Section 3, school vouchers. 4 magnet schools, 5 private schools, and then other sources of other forms of school choice. Now, this is a rather in-your-face approach to school choice. It's called Break These Chains, The Battle for School Choice by Dan McGroarty, who's a great fellow, great guy. And but the point he makes, and granted, the language is, it's deliberately inflammatory because you've got to rouse people out of their ennui. And so the first section is called The Education Plantation. Right? And he says, room 207, autopsy report. And then section 2 is called Emancipation, White Lies, The Empire Strikes Back, Davis versus Grover. And then section 3, Church, State, and Choice, And number 4, the report card. Accentuate when you're dealing, he says, when you're talking about public education, accentuate the negative and eliminate the positive. But as I say, it's I think a necessary corrective. When he talks here about the race issue, for you Philadelphians, you may enjoy this. As I think I mentioned, from 80 to 85, I worked for the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, and Cardinal Kroll was a great supporter of ours, and he had us open a chapter of the organization here in Philadelphia. And Bill Valenti, who taught law at Villanova, he may have gone from Villanova down to Baltimore, I'm not sure, but he was a great constitutional lawyer, and he was the president of our chapter. And so this was the 80 to 85, and all the talk about school choice and everything was percolating at the time. And I was invited by the pastor of Our Lady of Mercy in Callow Hill to come in the summer, August of all things, to do a workshop for parents on how to lobby on behalf of the voucher program. And so let's say the program was to begin at 7:30, and I should mention the school was about 98% black and about 80% not Catholic. And so about 7:25, we're all in this auditorium that has no air conditioning and no windows, and this big old fan that's probably just circulating hot air more than anything else. And at 7:25, there's the sister principal, myself, and the pastor, and 2 people. And I said, well, this doesn't look like this is going to be a great success. And the nun said, oh, no, they come a little late, and by 7:45, we had about 200 parents. I said, oh, okay. So I gave my, by then, well-honed speech on the whole issue of school choice and how to lobby for it and all the rest. And at the end, I said, now, I know that most of you are not Catholic, but you have your children in our schools, and we're delighted. And if you've learned anything about the Catholic approach to reality, we believe that the church is a family, and that's why, for example, our full-time religious professionals are called by family names: father, brother, sister, mother, so forth. I said, so I hope that you will consider me as a member of your family as we consider you a member of our family. And as a family member, I would like to say something now that's very specific to this audience that I don't normally say. And the pastor was tensing up. And I said, I've taught you to lobby in the public forum. But let me say, before you go to lobby Whitey, you need to lobby your own black leaders, because they're almost universally against school choice. I said, Jesse Jackson has all of his kids in Catholic school in Chicago, but he's the leading voice against vouchers and tax credits and all the rest. And I said, those examples can be multiplied. And I said, that's all I want to say. Any questions? The Ice Age descended. We didn't need air conditioning or anything. And I said, any questions? And the body language was terrible. And then an old black matriarch from the back said, Father, can I come up and say something? Oh, Lord. And so she comes up front. She takes the microphone away from me. She said, I know you don't like what the father said. I don't like it neither. The question ain't whether we like it, but whether it's true. And we all know it's true. And so we're not leaving here today until the father gets an amen on what he said. She said, I don't hear you. I said, amen. She said, that's a white amen. Amen. She said, Father, I think there are going to be questions now. I was there for another hour. Right? But see, I think that's something else that in the whole lobby effort. Now, I understand that a number of years ago, that whole operation folded, unfortunately, at Our Lady of Mercy. But it was a very, very successful project that was going on there. And I think that's another area in terms of, talked yesterday about forming coalitions with the black community. I told some of the fathers at one of the meals, as a seminarian, I was vice principal of a inner city school in Trenton. And 2 weeks before school began, the boiler broke, and which had been the original boiler when the school was established in 72 years earlier. And the repairman said, this admits of no repair. This is finished. Have a solemn requiem mass for it. It's over. And so we had to supposedly buy a new boiler, which was going to cost $65,000. And the pastor said, we don't have it, and there's no way to get it. And so he said, it looks like we're not going to reopen after Labor Day. And he said, I don't know how we should get the word out or what. Well, the word got out somehow or other, and the leader of the black ministerium called him and said, Monsignor, we hear that there's a problem with reopening Blessed Sacrament School. And he said, yeah. And he said, well, Blessed Sacrament can't close. He said, the future of our community is in that school. And he said, well, I agree with you. He said, but I can tell you, he said, I can change bread and wine into the body of Christ, but I can't change paper into money. And he said, if you're so in favor of the school, maybe you can do something. Well, Monday morning, he came to us with $250,000, and all the black churches of that area, they took up a collection for Blessed Sacrament School. And the pastor said, maybe we should break something else here and, and see where it goes. But see, that's an alliance that people often don't count on, and how much certain people really do appreciate what we do there. Another issue is, and this was the very, very short-sighted approach of bishops in the 60s and in the early 70s, was the idea that, right, the school, it's a new population that's there, they're not Catholic, close the school, save the parish. Well, in point of fact, closing the school actually facilitated more white flight because the school was social cohesiveness, and it was safety, and it was good education, and so it had the exact opposite of effect of what it should have. And so in almost all of these instances, closing the school becomes a band-aid for saving the parish, but long range, you find the parish itself falls apart after a while as well. Because, of course, we haven't done anything about evangelization. That's the other problem. And it just irks me no end when they say, well, a bunch of Asians have moved in and they're not even Christian. Okay, well, I think Francis Xavier had an idea about that, right? What do we do? Nothing. Well, they're not Christian. Well, you don't want to proselytize. No, who's talking about proselytizing? How about inviting? And so I think that's another one of that's a big internal problem that no one seems to want to talk about. And then there's a new program, or a development of a program that's existed for a bit, called the Theology of the Body for Teens, Discovering God's Plan for Love and Life. And this is Jason Evert and company that have been doing this kind of thing for years, but this is the new and improved version, and so there's a student handbook, there's a teacher manual, there's a video, and so forth. And I think it's just a very, very good approach, and it's a positive approach to Catholic to chastity. And as I mentioned briefly in the homily the other day, I really think that I believe that every single moral teaching of the church is 100% correct, but the packaging of it historically has been horrific. And it just comes off as a series of negativities, just devastating effects on people and all the rest of it, whereas it really can be properly packaged in a way that is perceived to be truly liberating and Christian, and very, very human as a result. And then finally, the sister who produced that virtue education program, Sister John Dominic, has, these are Okay, these are all the books that go with that Virtue Ed program. So, and she introduces children to to Lectio Divina. And, people say, oh, well, that's for, people at the, the 10th mansion or something. And, but in point of fact, little ones can actually do quite well with it. And so she gives a little scripture passage. And of course, if you use this whole approach about imagination and, the locus and all of that, well, kids are tremendous with that, huh? And then so they record their reflections in their little journal. And so, for example, Raising of Lazarus. This is a guide through the Gospels. So, Lazarus, 11. Prayer. Father, anoint me with your Holy Spirit, so that as I read your eternal word, it may penetrate my whole being and transform me into a faithful disciple of Christ. That's the prayer before each of these Lectios. And then, God's word strikes the heart. What word or phrase touched your heart? Second, what did St. John reveal about Jesus' friendship with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus? How long had Lazarus been in the tomb? What was Martha's reaction? Reread verses 41 to 44. Who was Jesus praying to? Oh, sister, that should have been whom. Was his prayer answered? How? And then a quote, Jesus, before you raised Lazarus, you asked Martha to proclaim her faith and believe in you. Show me how my faith in you may be lacking. Write down what he shows you. Then Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life, and so forth. Write a prayer stating your belief in Jesus and the resurrection of the dead. So, this is something that certainly can be done, I would say, certainly by 4th grade. Huh? And I think she even has something that's a little less challenging for the littler ones. So between those two, those sisters have really done a bang-up job on Catholic education. And, we've got some new communities of women religious that have surfaced, and they're very, loyal and faithful to the church, and they have their heads screwed on straight, but most of them are not involved in education. But these are the Ann Arbor Dominicans, and then, of course, the Nashville Dominicans, who never gave up the ghost at all. And, of course, they have a huge community problem. They can't process the number of vocations that they have. And they just built an extension to the Mother House, 3 years ago, and now they have to build another extension. So, if they could simply transfer some of these mother houses of the dead communities and move them to the places where they're working. All right, so we're only 5 minutes over, right? So, any questions about resources? Yeah, Father.
I have a question of the resources that you've given us. I don't see anything that mentions, I don't know if there is a publication, I know you've given us articles, but as far as a book talking about the priests in the school, does such a book exist?
Not that I'm aware of. Maybe if you go on to get a master's in education, that could be your dissertation. See, that's another thing that really, really concerns me. And Sister Maureen alluded to this on Tuesday evening. I think most people, starting with bishops, have become quite comfortable with the idea that we will never again have clerical leadership in Catholic education. And inter nos, I think that is a disaster. And there is something that we bring to the table that nobody else can bring. And we're not talking about, magical concepts or anything of that nature, but there is something that is innate to us because of our priestly life and vocation that we bring to the educational process that nobody else can. And and if we are professionally trained in education and are faithful to our priestly vocation, that's an unbeatable combination. And it's the same on the teacher side about what does a woman religious or a male religious bring. If you can have a very faithful lay Catholic teach biology, that's wonderful. And I would certainly have a faithful lay Catholic teach biology than a kooky nun or priest doing it, all right? But, you know, we ought not to be in those stark dichotomies. There ought to be a way that we can have the competent cleric or religious doing that, and therefore bring the extra that goes with it. And again, I go back to, you know, the point I've made repeatedly, pulling the priests out of the classroom. I had a discussion with a bishop, oh my gosh, 25 years ago, because I had a priest of his diocese in one of my classes at Seton Hall. And I saw the bishop at some social event, and he said, I hear you have Father so-and-so in your class. I said, yeah. He said, how's he doing? I said, good. I said, I'm really glad. I said, I think he'll be a real asset, because he was getting a degree in school administration. I said, he'll be an asset to your diocesan school system. He said, well, I've got some news for him that he's not going to like, but when he finishes his degree, he said, I don't need him in a school. He's going to be back in a parish. And I said, well, I think that's very short-sighted. And I said, I understand that you've already yanked priests from the high schools from the secular subjects. And he said, yeah. And I said, I think that's a mistake too. And he said, well, when you get a party hat on your head, you can do what you want. That's what I do. And so he had been, you know, completely dismissive of the whole thing. But my approach to some more reasonable bishops had been to say, you know, when you pull them out of these environments, these are precisely the environments that have created the circumstances by which you get more priests, right? And instead, you know, you pull them out of there, and then what's the answer? Where is the influence? Where is it coming from? And but I hope that we might be able. I was quite surprised that there's a bishop. I knew him as an auxiliary, and he was not at all favorable to Catholic education. And I don't know what happened. He became an ordinary a couple of years ago, and I've been astonished to discover that he has put back priests into high school work. That diocese hadn't had priests in full-time high school work in probably 20 years, and he's put them back in the past 2 years. And there was another situation. One time I was out to dinner with a friend, a high school classmate, and I meant to turn that off. It was one of those restaurants where you have to pass through the bar to get into the restaurant. And so we had dinner, and then as we were leaving, going through the bar, the young bartender said, hey, Father, he said, are you a new priest at the parish? And I said, no, I'm just visiting my friend. And he said, oh, he said, because I have a brother who's in the seminary. And I said, oh, he's my baby brother. And I said, where is he? And he mentioned the seminary. I said, college of theology. And he said, college. I said, oh, good. And I said, what high school did he go to? And he mentioned the high school. And I said, oh, I know that place. And he said, I said, is your brother the first vocation from the school in a long time? And he said, no, actually, there are 4 of his contemporaries, a year before him and a year behind him, who are all in college seminary now. And I said, oh, really? I said, what's the grand secret? And he said, we just have had a fantastic priest who's been principal there for the past 15 years. And I said, well, that's great. That's a real treasure. And he said, yeah, tell that to the bishop. He just yanked him and made him a pastor. Huh? You have a man that's been able to produce 4 vocations in 5 years. You haven't connected the dots to say, perhaps he's the reason that's happening there? I don't understand it. I really, really don't. So, but that will be one of my first questions on Judgment Day, how and why this all happened. So, all right, well, let's take a 15-minute break and then meet upstairs for the video on the Common Core. And I'm doing it because I think it's something that we need at least to be conversant in.